The way the results are panning out, I think it's a slap in the face of all those pollsters and all those newspapers which were predicting a landslide in favor of Biden.
The people who were voting for Biden were not enthusiastic about Biden. They didn't care about him at all. They were voting because they hated Trump.
There is an anti-elitism, anti-elite, anti-liberal, anti-left liberal.
I'm joined by an esteemed panel right now to discuss the implications of what's happening in the US elections so far. And there's Pramit Pal, who's consulting editor with Hindustan Times, and of course, a very senior journalist with decades of experience behind him. I have Sushant Sareen, senior fellow, Observer Research Foundation, and I have Yashwant Deshmukh, a renowned pollster who has done extensive polling in the United States in 2016 and this time too. Those who hoped for a swift and emphatic, um, you know, uh, rejection of Donald Trump, and even those who expected a repeat of his 2016 electoral college victory, were both left disappointed tonight in the United States.
With this kind of presidency, with this kind of criticism, with this kind of division and failure and COVID and everything, ideally speaking, there should be an anti-incumbency wave in America. Ideally speaking, Mr. Joe Biden should have been looking at a kind of result which probably, sweep like Ronald Reagan. I mean, something of that sort of sweep, given the condition. But that did not happen. Are we missing something here? The way Americans have voted has only confirmed one thing, that the divisions in a division, the fault lines in American society are even deeper as we are talking. The red states have become redder, the blue states have become bluer, and the swing states are not really voting entirely as if rejecting Donald Trump. So we are missing something here. The AP exit poll number, and I was going through the data of Addison exit poll. Big number of people who voted on the issue of economy, they voted for Trump. Big number of people who voted on the issue of Corona, they voted towards Biden, anti-Trump. But the fact is, the number of people who said they voted for economy was bigger than the number of people who said they voted because of Corona crisis. So we are missing seriously in this entire democratic narrative. There is something which is missing. What exactly, that probably Sareen Saab would be in a better position to say, but this certainly, to me, it seems like that there is some. I'm not commenting eventually who is going to win. Maybe even after that, Mr. Biden can become the president. I'm not denying that, but there is an anti-elitism, anti-elite, anti-liberal, anti-left liberal narrative that goes around. People, even the centrist voters are not really accepting that.
See, what's missing is that journalism has become activism. Advocacy has taken the place of analysis. And what the liberal media in the US has been trying to do has been actually trying to prop a narrative or flog a narrative which probably was not being borne out by what the ground realities of the US was. Or they were they were in a kind of an echo chamber where they were capturing only the voices which they wanted to hear. We've seen something similar happen in India. 2017, let's talk about the UP election. How can any journalist worth his salt miss a wave in which one party is getting 320 out of 400 seats? Either you got to be blind or you got to be utterly prejudiced to be able to do that. And there were so-called very highly regarded journalists who go right down to the wire, who were predicting that BJP is going to come 3. 2019 elections, how many people were able to call an election in which a party wins almost 40% of the vote, which is normally seen as a landslide in India? They missed that picture. They wanted to miss it. So desire and prejudice has become the guiding light of journalism and to some extent of pollsters as well. And the intellectual terrorism of the left has actually kind of bludgeoned people into silence. So people will say, okay, fine, when I go to the polling booth, I'll go and drop the vote the way I want to vote. But why should I tell anybody which way I'm going to vote? And I can tell you of a whole lot of people who were inclined to vote in a certain way, precisely what happened in the last election in the US. A lot of people were embarrassed by saying that, yes, I think maybe Trump, what he says, has a point, that's the way I'm going to go about it. So I think, journalism is in a manner of speaking dead. It's all advocacy in one way or another. Secondly, I think what the way the results are panning out, I think it's a slap in the face of all those pollsters and all those newspapers which were predicting a landslide in favor of Biden. Now, when Yashwant says that, look, given all that what was happening, how come it's such a nail-biting finish? Well, how do we know all that what was happening is all that we were reading in the Western liberal media, and so that kind of colored our analysis or our thinking of what was actually happening on the ground in the US. So as a result, when we see a nail-biting finish, we are a little stunned by this sudden turn of events, what has happened.
The liberal media in the list of battleground states, I started looking at the state called Texas. And I was like, Texas, battleground, swing state. Okay, so basically you are painting a scenario that things are so bad for Trump that even Texas has turned a battleground state. From that narrative, which was being peddled for almost like months in and months out, that this is going to be a sweep of historic proportion, that the turnout is going to be a historic high, and people, well, I'm sorry, I don't see that. I mean, 6 or 7 point lead in Texas, which was secularly maintained throughout the counting, regardless of postal ballots or not. I mean, when I totally get it when Sushant says that, as a pollster, my job is basically to say whether this call is within my margin of error or not. If it is within my margin of error, I would simply say, sorry, folks, this is too close to call. But if not, and if I know that historically speaking, this is how it has been, if I know that on all the divisive issues, all the fault lines, they are even more exposed than they were 4 years back, then the chances are that blues are going to be bluer and the reds are going to be redder in all probability, and it's probably going to be close, quite close, and this is precisely where it is heading. So I think all in all, I am more pained. I mean, for the first time, honestly speaking, I got so disappointed with CNN. I mean, in that way, that I tuned into Fox to watch it sometime to understand what exactly is going on, because they were the last one to call Texas when Reuters, AP, MSNBC, NBC, everybody had called. Even after that, they were holding on to call in Texas simply because that's the narrative they had set in for months, that Texas is a swing state. It's too close to call in Texas. Texas can flip. And if Texas can flip, hell is going to fall down on Trump, because that's where, that's the equivalent probably of Modi losing Gujarat. If Modi loses Gujarat, what is left in Uttar Pradesh? So it's that kind of equivalent for me, when as a pollster, when I'm talking about numbers or the public perception. So that is where I feel people are missing the finer point. Finer point, or maybe not so finer point, is America has been a bitterly divided country for quite some time, quite a long time actually. But those fault lines are now exposed like never before. And no matter who comes to power, no matter Mr. Biden comes to power, or my fear is that if Mr. Biden comes to power at all, the Democrats are not going to learn from their mistakes. They are going to brazen it out on their agenda and alienate the remaining centrists towards the Republicans. That's what I feel. That is precisely what we have seen in other countries. We have seen that happening in UK. Look at the way the Labour leaders have pushed the centrists towards the Tories in UK. Look at the way in India. We have seen how the left liberals in India, in their agenda, have pushed the centrists towards the BJP kitty to a big time. So this is something when Obama said, that liberals are now behaving like a circular firing squad. That was not without a reason. How can you have a degree of liberalism that you are not enough liberal for me, so you are basically a conservative? This very thought process that you are not liberal enough is so illiberal, and that is where I guess that it's a global narrative, I believe, and you can see that meaning regardless of this election. Even if Mr. Biden becomes president, it will be Pyrrhic victory. It will be a victory which will be always seen as that he somehow crossed the line, even after having so much things working in his favor.
The mainstream media, or the coastal elite media of America, is not read or consumed by the people who support Trump. In fact, it's not even arguably consumed by a lot of moderate independent Americans. There's a very clear different media sphere that they function in which Fox News and various other organizations operate. So they wouldn't be reading the New York Times or USA Today or anything like that. And there's a very clear division of that if you visit small town America, you can see that's very evident. I personally covered the first Barack Obama election on the ground, and I used buses. I found that was the best way to get around because you met people right at the bottom end of the society in buses. And I traveled from Kansas, Missouri, and all of these states rather than into New York and Washington. And it's a very different ecosystem. They function at a completely different level. The interesting thing that was striking, as Yashwant correctly said, even then it was very clear that a sense of betrayal by the coastal elites was dominant. And in fact, Obama, it's important to realize, Obama won 9 million white worker votes who defected when Hillary became the candidate, and then voted for Trump. So they voted for Obama, refused to vote for Hillary, but then voted for Trump, even though Trump and Obama ideologically could not be further apart.
Right.
What was the joining force was a belief that Obama represented, and he was an outsider. He was not part of the establishment. Right? So he was black, he was different, he was not part of the elite. And so they voted for him, were disappointed, but nonetheless, he twice came in on that basis. When Hillary came in, they said, oh, she's so clearly a member of the coastal elite, we're not voting for her at all. And so 8 to 9 million of those people then defected to Trump. And so that continues to be the dominant issue. So for me, what struck me is that while the polling evidence, as others mentioned, gave a clear edge to Biden, I think what was striking for me was the turnout figures. The enormous turnout. I mean, 67% in America is the highest they've had in 100 years. That's a staggeringly high turnout. But it also means that the pollsters are not going to get it, because you're catching a lot of people are coming out there who are simply invisible to pollsters. Because they always say, have you voted in the last few elections? Oh, that means you're a likely voter, therefore let me quiz you. And if you tell them, oh, no, I haven't voted in the past 20 years, they're like, oh, then you're irrelevant to my polling. But look at the figure. Pennsylvania in 2016, it has a population of only about 13 million people. 2.4 million people who were eligible to vote in 2016 didn't bother to cast their ballots, of whom 1.5 million were white workers, white worker males, who are Trump's core constituents.
Right.
This is replicated in almost every state in the United States. So when Trump is being able to produce enormous turnout figures, because whatever else, his base is fanatically loyal to him. When I was looking at that, and I said to myself, then that the pollsters can't possibly be catching this. I don't know whether they're wrong or right, but they can't be catching this, because the turnout figures will completely distort your numbers. The question was Trump getting the turnout or was Biden getting the turnout? And the answer was both were getting the turnout. But what is also, I would argue, interesting to note, that this is based on anecdotal evidence, reading the news, guys who were on the journalists, American journalists who did go around on their cars and interview people, is that Biden, and all even the polling evidence, was that Biden, the people who were voting for Biden were not enthusiastic about Biden. They didn't care about him at all. They were voting because they hated Trump. So you had the vote, the turnout for Trump was because they liked Trump or they believed in him. The vote for Biden was only that Biden wasn't Trump. So that's a very different, I would argue, a very different motivating force, which is why my guess, and we'll see when eventually somebody goes through the numbers after the election, you will find out that the turnout, the high turnout, ultimately benefited by, Trump more than it did Biden. And that's one of the reasons a lot of these states ended up not going the way that the polls are expecting. And in particular in the South. These are the Republican-dominated areas. Even though I would argue, and I would disagree with Yashwant here on slightly, that states like Georgia and North Carolina, definitely not Texas, I would agree with him on that, are slowly purpling. They're becoming slightly more and more blue because they're becoming wealthier, suburbanized, and a non-white population is growing, which is why they took such a long time to declare. Normally, Georgia is a state that the Republicans would, nobody would even think that they had to fight all the way to the last vote. But the rest of it was relatively clear. Arizona is another state that was never completely in the Republican camp, but it's definitely a state that is also demographically changing quite rapidly. But the question then was again the turnout for me, and my view was that I think you'll find out that Trump's turnout figures are going to be much, much better than Biden's, and this is one of the reasons why the pollsters got it completely wrong.
Interesting observation there. Sushant, can I come to you now and talk about the fact that both the sides you said are lawyering up, but apart from that, many are also predicting riots in the US in the coming days. Do you see that happening?
I'll just come to the riots thing, but just let me add something to what Pramit just said. If you look at, don't look at the states as such, but you break it down into some of the important counties, you'll see something quite interesting.